I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the executive director of the Jewish Women's Archive, and I am delighted to be here today interviewing Jaclyn Friedman about her new book, Unscrewed, for JWA's book club. Let me say a few words first about who Jaclyn is, for those of you who did not come to this video because you are already major fans of her work. Jaclyn is a writer and activist. She's the founder of Women Action and the Media, and she is the author of 3 books, Yes Means Yes, What You Really, Really Want, and her new book, Unscrewed, which we'll be talking about today. She also has an amazing podcast by the same name, Unscrewed, which I highly recommend that you check out as soon as you finish watching this video. So welcome, Jaclyn.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am super psyched to be talking to you today. So maybe just start off by telling us a little bit about how you got involved in this work and what kind of brought you to the place of writing this book.
Woo! I mean, how long do we have? I became an anti-rape activist in college. I actually started working on the issue before I was myself sexually assaulted in college, which happened the spring of my junior year. And it was actually one of the sort of disorienting things about that terrible experience, which was like, I kind of thought since I was politically woke on the issue that it wouldn't happen to me, which turns out not to be true. But that experience certainly radicalized me, and gave me sort of a new fire in the belly about it. And I did a lot of campus activism around changing the way that my school adjudicated on campus cases of sexual violence. And I just stayed passionate about the issue. And as I, worked on it in one way or another throughout my 20s and into my 30s, I just started to realize that we can't talk about rape without talking about sex. And there was this truism back in the day that got said all the time in anti-rape circles, which is rape is not about sex. And it's true in the very specific sense that it was originally meant, which is rape is not an act of like sexual incontinence, right? It's not about somebody getting too turned on to control themselves. It's an act of power and dominance and violation. But it got taken to this extreme where you really couldn't talk about sex and the sexual culture and sexual violence at the same time. And I and a bunch of other people, especially through the early feminist blogosphere, conversations happening there, really came to understand that you can't address sexual violence without addressing the sexual culture, right? Because one enables the other, and it's actually a feedback loop, right? Like it's literally the same issue. And so pulling those two issues together, the issue of sexual liberation and the issue of ending sexual violence and getting justice for survivors, has become kind of the place that I live. My last book that I wrote, What You Really, Really Want, the one before Unscrewed, was basically a handbook for all the women I met who said, I love the idea of affirmative consent, but how do I know what I want to say yes or no to? Like, how do I even know? And so I wrote this book about how you figure out how to navigate an authentic sexuality for yourself in a world that doesn't want you to. But I took as given that the sexual culture is just broken in that book, and that it picked at me, in the back of my head, because the culture, I've always believed the culture is made of people. The culture is what we all collectively decide that it is. And so Unscrewed, I think, is sort of the flip side or companion piece to that book, which, the first book is like, okay, let's accept the culture is broken. Here's how to live your best sex life in it. And this book is saying, but the culture does not actually have to be broken. Here's how we could actually fix it. That's a long answer to your question.
No, but a really great and rich one, and gets at one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, which is, the fact that one of the main arguments of Unscrewed is really about the fact that the sexual culture, as you're saying, is broken, that the roots of the problem are systemic. And we have this screwed up sexual culture. And one of the things you point out, using a term that you call faux powerment, is that so many of the fixes that are proposed and that we often kind of buy into as ways that we think can liberate ourselves are individual solutions, and therefore are not really making a change in the overall system. And I think this gets at this kind of ongoing, longstanding tension in feminist conversation about sexuality between, for lack of more complicated terms between like victimhood and agency. And obviously this is very reductive and a way of pitting feminists against each other instead of getting people to create kind of nuanced analysis and work together. But how do you navigate that tension and kind of tease apart, you know, sort of, and I think your two books are both working on that, sort of how do you as an individual figure out, you know, how to navigate, and where do you have agency to do that, and where are you kind of screwed by the way the culture is, and then also how do you change the system as an individual or working with other people?
That's a lot of questions.
I know. Well, I mean, I think it gets at this big question, which I think comes up again and again, and we see it, like I saw it this week, and any week that I was doing this interview, I could say I saw it this week in culture. Yep. But, you know, these questions around, so much of the conversation around sexuality is framed around women are victims or women have agency, and
I feel like it's almost always the wrong question because it's almost always focused on the choices or actions of one individual woman. Mm-hmm. And while we are as individuals important, and I support whatever we need to do as long as it's not hurting anybody else in terms of getting as free as we can, you know, and getting the as close to the life we want within our constraints. Always focusing on here's what you as an individual could do to feel more empowered, like it is never going to actually create cultural change, right? In order to create cultural change, we have to talk about those systems. So, you know, the week we're recording this, you're talking about the Aziz Ansari case, and there's all this conversation about why didn't she leave? Why didn't she do this? Why didn't she do that? Like, she's kind of letting down the side for feminism if we're saying it's okay for her to do that because she's supposed to have agency. Well, who says this 23-year-old young woman can just decide her way free? Like, why aren't we talking about what kind of sex ed she received? Why, and the way the religious right controls so much of sex ed, right? Why aren't we talking about the economics of porn? You know, like, why aren't we talking about Facebook's rules for moderation and ads, all of which influence how we think of ourselves and what options we feel like we have in those intense personal moments. And so focusing on the choices and behaviors, like, is taking off your shirt in public liberating or self-exploitative? It's almost always the wrong question. The question should be, do you feel like taking off your shirt in public is your only choice to get attention and power from men? You know, like, or is it a genuine expression of something you feel right now? Right. So the question is, like, what systems are operating here?
Right.
And so I'm very exhausted from this sort of victim feminism versus power feminism conversation. Also, as though there's no power in saying I was hurt and I demand justice. And right. You know, and also as though, like, seizing power doesn't sometimes get us victimized, right? As though those are severable categories.
Right, absolutely. I think that's really important, that we can't always separate these things, and acknowledging that there are systems that shape who we are doesn't mean that we aren't people with agency. It's just then the next step of the conversation is figuring out how do you use that agency to make a greater change. And I think often
and I don't think that we are of how much agency we have, and that is really uncomfortable, right?
Right. I think
the faux empowerment messages are so appealing because they say the only thing in the way of you having all the power you want is you can just decide your way out of this. And that's so much more appealing than we have to deal with these oppressive cultural systems before you can access full power.
Right, which, by the way, don't just oppress women, right? You know, they oppress everybody, people of all genders. And I think, you know, sometimes I think in our desire to articulate a vision of what it could be to be a liberated person, we forget that it's aspirational, that we're not there yet. And so, you know, there are still a lot of other forces that are impinging upon the situation, and naming those things doesn't mean that we're limiting what's possible in the world. It's just describing things as they currently are.
Yes.
But speaking also of individuals, one of the things that I found really just fun and exciting about your book was learning about all these amazing people who you profiled and who you met with as part of your research. And I wondered if you could share, I mean, and that was really, I think, a very good example of how you can look at it, how an individual is able to make change by kind of looking at the bigger picture and different places where people are, you know, are kind of finding an area where a small change could be made that has real ripple effects. So I wondered if you could share what some of your kind of favorite people or encounters were that you had in the research of this book, which seems
Oh,
like
I mean, you can't ask me to pick favorites, but
okay, not a favorite, but one that stands out or that you're,
sure. I mean, I was just so happy that all of those folks allowed me to spend some time with them. I certainly didn't know most of them going in. And I really felt very strongly that in a book that takes deep dives into the dysfunctional systems that are creating our sexual culture, that if I didn't also talk about what great work was being done to change those systems, A, it would be a really depressing read, and B, people would be left just feeling like, wow, this is overwhelming. And what I want people to be left with is the feeling like, oh, there's so many different ways to get involved in changing this. I'm just going to pick one, right? And so those stories are not included as sort of like, these are the ways. It's more like, these are some ways. Look at how diverse they all are, even from each other, their approaches. And my hope is that people will feel like social change is demystified a little by telling those stories, right? So, who stands out? I mean, Cherise Scott, who runs Sister Reach, made a big impact on me, in part because that's just a world I don't know. So Sister Reach is a reproductive justice project in Memphis, Tennessee, deep red country. And she, it's not an exclusively faith-based organization, but she has this faith-based initiative where they're using the Bible to train clergy how to support reproductive justice, like using the Bible. And I learned so much from her about what is and isn't in the Bible. Like, for example, abortion, not mentioned. There's nothing about it. That I just assumed it was in the New Testament somewhere. Right. Where did all the Christians talk about it? And I just was so inspired by her just refusing to see the ground of faith to quote unquote religious right, who claim that they have all this moral high ground, but in fact are standing on lies and racism, basically. And I tell that story in that chapter. So I just think that she's doing this beautiful work, building a small army of clergy who are standing on their faith and on the Bible in support of reproductive justice. That one definitely stands out. I mean, the kids in Alaska were amazing.
Yeah, I think that chapter just blew my mind.
And I didn't say this specifically because we made a number of choices throughout where we didn't want the book to age too quickly, but I was there like the weekend after the election of 2016. Like, they were all processing, like, it was intense. Everyone was in their feelings. So I visited in Juneau, Alaska, with a group of young people who are the teen council for Planned Parenthood in Alaska, who educate their peers on sex ed, and they also lobby to save sexual rights, like at the state legislature level, successfully, I might add. They're so together. And I got to sit in on a 9th grade class on consent that they did for their peers at Thunder Mountain High School in Juneau. And I just, I mean, some of that stuff made my heart so happy, just sort of like to hear kids getting it and talking about all this stuff that means so much to me. And then some of it made me feel so sad because, like, this is the only conversation on consent they're going to have in their entire high school or entire educational career before they get to college and possibly after. And A, it was interrupted by a fire drill, and like B, it didn't even have to happen. It wasn't mandated. It just happened to be that teacher decided to invite them in. And it was encouraging to see how much was possible with so little, and just to hang out with young people who were like really, really passionate about this stuff. But it was also just I also just had this feeling like we're letting them down. Like, I wish they didn't have this work to do. Like, I wish we'd gotten it together already so they could just be teenagers.
Yeah. I found that chapter really powerful, and just such an important reminder that, I think so much of the way that our society talks about sex, and particularly about sex ed, is like the assumption is that older people need to somehow educate and, direct young people in what healthy sexuality looks like, just because as if by virtue of being an adult and theoretically having had more sex, you know more about this, right? And that chapter,
yeah,
right, and that chapter just was such an important reminder that we have a lot to learn from teens. And in fact, they're navigating a lot of situations that some of us as adults haven't navigated because we didn't grow up in the age of the internet, and, you know, and all kinds of things that they're just so so tapped into and so wise about. And, you know, I definitely experienced this in my work at JWA. We work with some amazing teens, and we learn so much from them about what we need to be doing, what we need to be offering, how to be in conversation with them in productive ways. And they are leaders already. It's like, we're not teaching them how to be leaders. They are leading, and we are learning from them. And that came through in that chapter, along with the sadness of that this is still the battle that they have to fight and what the odds are against, like what's stacked against them. But the fact that they are really directing things in a very powerful and sensitive way is just amazing.
And I think they're more effective, honestly, than an adult would be in that situation and talking to ninth graders about consent. You know,
Sure.
I was a little skeptical going into that class. Like, it's a mixed gender class, you know, it's just like a class period for them in the middle of a high school day. Like, they're all going to suddenly talk about sexual consent with each other and out in the open. And they did. And the boys were like they got it. Like, it was really cool. And I think that even if I, let's say, and I think that I'm a really good educator, had come in, there'd be that distance of like, I am the grown-up trying to tell you how it is, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like they're coming in and saying like, let's all talk about this together.
Yeah. It is, right. We can learn a lot from how they are able to create good context for these conversations.
Yeah.
So you write a little bit in your book actually about your own sexual coming of age in the context of your Jewish youth group. Yay, nifty. And at JWA, one of the things that we're thinking a lot about in this particular moment is the role of Jewish communal spaces in shaping the sexual experiences and identities of young Jews, and, you know, women in particular. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about what is most important for institutions like youth groups to be offering young people in this moment.
I've been thinking about this a little because I recently became aware of the point system, which I'm going to sound like an old lady, but I was like, in my day, we didn't have that.
I will say in my day in the 80s in USY, that system was definitely in place.
Really? Because I was in the 80s in GIFTY and we did not, I was unaware of it anyway. I certainly did my share of fooling around at conclaves. Like, I'm not saying there wasn't hooking up happening.
Right.
The point thing, I was like, right? I think that it's a difficult task to affirm young people's impulse and right towards sexual exploration, but also to affirm their responsibility to be humane, right, with their partners and themselves, right? And that doesn't just mean use protection and that sort of thing, but it also means, what are you talking about if you're treating sex like an acquisition or an accomplishment or a game, right? But who is going to get hurt? So I really think that what I'd like to see being taught is sexual ethics, right? Not you should or shouldn't be doing it. And that's not a super Jewish conversation anyway, thank goodness. I get asked that a lot, like, what did your religious upbringing teach you about sex? And I was like, it's a double mitzvah on the Sabbath. Like, that is not where I got any of my sex guilt from. And so I think there's this great opportunity to sort of really lean into that and just talk about how do you be sexual in a Jewish way, right? In an ethical, moral way. That's about affirming each other's humanity. I think that we're capable of having these conversations with teenagers. Teenagers are very capable of having that conversation.
Yeah. And I think in some places it is happening. I don't mean to say that across the board, you know, there isn't acknowledgement of that, but I think there's fear in some cases around having it. Like, what are the messages that, you know, the unanticipated messages that might be sent? And my sense is that when we worry about that, we're once again kind of underestimating what teens are capable of hearing, and also just what the reality of teen life is.
Well, also, let me tell you, in countries that they have comprehensive pleasure-based sex ed starting in kindergarten, the age of sexual debut is not lower, right? So
Right.
I know that that's a fear that so many adults have. I literally wrote about this for a piece I published today. There's this very deep fear that by talking about sex with teenagers, you're going to encourage them to have it. Teenagers already know that sex seems fun, right? You're not giving them information they don't have.
Right.
And there's no evidence to suggest that educating teenagers, frankly, about sex encourages them to have it if they weren't already going to do it. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. If you look at other countries with a very different approach, their teenagers are not having more sex, they're just having more sex safely and humanely.
Right.
So I just wish I could tell literally everyone with that fear that information, because it's a real fear. But I also question a little bit, like, so what if they have, like the idea that the good is always to discourage teenagers from having sex. I have questions about that. I don't think it's a universal good.
Though I think about some of the times when I've taught some of this material, and a mistake that I think I inadvertently made, which you talk about in your book also making, which is in an effort to like acknowledge and sanction women's pleasure, sort of not leaving space for people who are not sexually active, whether by choice or not, as also a totally valid choice and experience.
Yeah, when I first started doing this work, I way overshot the mark on that. I was like, it's okay, go be slutty, and I started hearing from young people who were like, hey, like, I felt like you were saying that you have to have sex to be liberated. Like, you have to go do this stuff. And I was like, at first, you can have that defensive response, which is, I didn't say anything about that. And then I thought, oh, I didn't say anything about that. Right. And so it's true. You have to balance that. The message shouldn't be, yay, sex. The message should be, the most important sexual relationship you're ever going to have is the one you have with yourself, and that you are the boss of it. Right. What seems right for you is the most important thing.
Yeah. And knowing that first, and then being able to communicate about that, and,
yes,
in terms of your ability to do that and other people's ability to engage in that with you, which I think is so important.
There's a great resource for people who are thinking about this, or maybe have young people at home, or maybe are young people thinking about this. I always recommend scarletteen.com, and they have a sex readiness checklist where you can go through and think about whether you are emotionally ready and sort of also logistically ready for partnered sexual experiences. And it's totally judgment-free. There's no right answer. It's just it's sort of a check-in about, like, am I ready for this? Well, here are some things to think about.
Yeah, it's a great resource. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit, the topic of the religious right and religious communities came up a tiny bit before, but I want to get back to that. You have an entire chapter in your book, a very sobering chapter, I will say.
That chapter made me want to throw my computer out the window so many times.
Yeah, on church and state. And obviously the chapter is mostly focused on the Christian right, but obviously these policies have an impact on religious communities across the board. And again, just from my seat here at JWA, I'm thinking about this, like, as Jews, what should our concerns be, and how should we be thinking about these issues, do you think?
Well, my concern right now is that religious freedom is getting determined as right-wing Christian freedom, right? That there continue to be these laws and executive orders that are supposed to be defending, quote unquote, religious freedom. The only people's religious freedom that are treated as valid are right-wing Christian values. And I almost want to use Christian in, like, air quotes, because it's not textually based, right? And so as a Jew, I'm incensed, right? Like, I feel like we should be speaking up and saying, hello, where's our religious freedom, right? Like, where's my religious freedom to self-determination over my own body, right? Like, where my religious freedom is being impinged on if I'm acting in concert with my religion, which supports the fact that, say, I'm transgender, I'm not, and I want to get medical care, and now I'm being discriminated against and I can't get medical care. Like, where's my religious freedom? And so I think that we have a special role, people of faith have a special role to stand up and say, not in our name, right? This is not about us. You are not actually concerned with religion.
Right. It's really about basically exclusion and and devaluing certain kinds of people over others. Yeah. It is, I think it is very easy for Jews to kind of think that, well, this is about a different kind of religious world and therefore does not have to do with us necessarily as Jews. But I think, there's a lot of power in standing up as a person from a particular community and saying, you can't speak for me.
Yeah.
In this way. So, one thing that I was thinking about a lot as I read this book was, that you wrote it before Me Too and most of it before the election. And on the one hand, it means the book is more important than ever and the urgency of it is like, through the roof and so obvious. On the other hand, I'm wondering if, there are things you wish you could have included or things you feel like are different now in some way. And, is there something that you wish you had said or that you wish you could tweak? And I know you're doing that in a lot of pieces, amazing pieces you're writing right now, but in terms of thinking about where this lands when you wrote it at this very particular transitional moment or right before it.
I mean, we did go back and do sort of a back edit after the election. Mm-hmm. Once I decided not to throw the entire project in the trash in a fit of despair. So I feel like we handled that well. I mean, the difficulty with that was like in each subsequent edit, as we got closer to agreeing this is the final manuscript, like things kept changing. Like when I was finalizing it, I was like, are we going to still have the ACA? I don't know, like things like that. So there's a number of places where it's like, as of this writing, here's what's the situation, but who can say? We also made a lot of decisions about how much Trump to put in because, again, we wanted to age well and we hope he does not last very long in the presidency. Right. So that I feel really like we handled well. I wish that I could go back and write some more stuff in the chapter about Hollywood and the media, mm-hmm. And the news media, specifically addressing what it means when predators, men who think that of women as cat toys, basically, are in control of the stories that shape our culture. And also what it means about all of the voices that have been lost from the media from women who've been driven out by sexual harassment and abuse. I think that I gesture at it, and there's certainly a lot of stuff in there about how important it is to have women behind the scenes in control of media and not just talking about representation, but it doesn't discuss that explicitly. And so, that's the number one thing I wish I would be able to go back and amend to Unscrewed for sure.
Yeah. I think a lot about that. I think of it as sort of like an invisible army of women who could have been in certain arenas and are not because,
I'm haunted by that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, to me as a historian, I think so much about the holes in our stories of what wasn't told and what wasn't preserved. And I feel like this is a whole other kind of absence, like very palpable, screaming absence that we have to reckon with. But I will say that given where we are in the world, every person needs this book as a guide of how to grapple with where we are and how to head us in a new direction. And, as you said earlier, there's a lot in this book that, is upsetting and depressing. And it also captures so many stories of, inspiring processes of change and steps for, very concrete steps for how to get there. And so I wondered if you could share a little bit about, are there things that are making you hopeful right now in this moment?
My hope meter it wavers a lot day to day. I think for me, women's anger is making me hopeful. That I think I see a lot of women being like, okay, I'm done pretending, mm-hmm. Who maybe were sitting on their hands a little bit before. I see a lot of people waking up. I definitely see a lot of young people taking the lead and speaking up, and that always makes me feel like, yes, let me just follow them. I got a text from a friend yesterday saying that her friend had told her that her daughter was at school and some boy in her class, she's a young kid, had said like something is for boys and not for girls. And her daughter had said, don't be a tool of the patriarchy. And then the teacher asked her to like if she knew what that word meant, and she was able to define it.
That's awesome.
So, I think, there's those green shoots of hope. But I think honestly, this whole Time's Up thing in Hollywood is giving me hope, not just because, fancy actresses are speaking out, but because they seem to be doing it very thoughtfully and deliberately in an intersectional way, organizing with farm workers and service workers and there seems to be a lot of real, genuine, deep solidarity being built, and that gives me hope. But mostly I approach hope kind of inspired by Rebecca Solnit.
Mm-hmm.
When she writes about it in Hope in the Dark. I think about hope most of the time as a decision, right? That the outcome is not known. If I decide there is no hope, the outcome is known, right? We will have the status quo or worse.
Right.
If I decide that something better might be possible to bring about, then it makes the outcome not be known. Mm-hmm. And so even when I am feeling really ground down, I can decide logically that even if I don't feel hope, that hope is the most productive stance to take.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's not very romantic.
No, and sometimes it is like we have to sort of talk ourselves into things intellectually and hope that our hearts follow. But your book is very much about the possibility, the belief in the possibility of change. And I think also, I often think about the words of Ruth Messenger, who's a leader who really inspires me. She's a former politician in New York and the head of the American Jewish World Service. And she just talks about not having the luxury of despair, that of course we should acknowledge when we feel it, but then also recognize that it's a luxury to allow yourself to just wallow in that. And that then we have to pick ourselves up and move on. And I often think about that, like the amount of despair that I feel as a relatively privileged person, how dare I in some way? So I think it is important to kind of seek out for ourselves the people and the texts and the models and images that are inspiring to us to kind of jumpstart that feeling when it is flagging as it will do in these trying times. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you would like to say or share?
The only thing I want to add is there's a little epilogue at the end of the book about how to get involved. And if people are watching or listening or thinking about the book and they're like, oh, this all feels too overwhelming, I don't know how to participate in this, I really break it down there. And I want to say, like, there is always something you can do, whether it's literally just finding someone who's already doing work that you think is good and asking them how to support it, or breaking down, say you want to change the way we teach sex ed in America, but that feels like a really overwhelming task, right? Breaking it down to its smallest component and thinking, well, could I change the way we teach sex ed in the 6th grade at this particular junior high school, right? So I just want to say that I hope the book is really inviting and helpful for people who wish the world could be different, but it feels too overwhelming to think about doing something about it. And that one of my main goals with it is to make that feel less overwhelming, to reduce the barriers to entry. I loved that epilogue. And it actually was really powerful to see, like you had sort of asked all these people that you had interviewed and talked to help, to sort of describe what their vision was of what their utopia was. And it was really hard for them to do. And that was actually very helpful for me, to realize like, oh, right. It's not like a lack of imagination on my part if I have trouble picturing that. Everyone, even the people who I think of as visionaries, have trouble with that. But then you shifted the question to just naming like, 3 things that they would like to see be different. And that is a totally different question and breaks it down into something that's so much more doable. And then if you add all those together, it creates this incredible picture. And I thought that was just a brilliant way to kind of step ourselves out of the kind of paralysis that we often feel of just like, God, if everything is systemic, how do you change it all? Know, and you pick one thing and start. That's it.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jaclyn. I encourage everybody to get this book wherever you buy books. If your independent bookseller doesn't carry it, ask them to. I did that, and you should too. And I look forward to speaking with you again, and thank you for everything that you write and do in the world.
And thanks for all that you do too at Jewish Women's Archive.
Thank you.
Thank you.